All right. We're ready to get started? Sorry, it must be very loud outside. Said, are we ready to get started? Yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting like rousing applause or anything, but you know, some kind of recognition that there are actually people in the room. I'm going to go and tell the organizers. I was like, it didn't even start and already they were applauding. So welcome. Welcome to my session this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, hi, my name is Amy. I am a front-end developer based in Perth. That's Perth, Australia, not any of the other number of Perths all over the world. And yes, I did come all of this way. Every time there's a couple of us here from Australia, and people ask where we're from, we say Australia, and they go, you really came all this way? It's like, well, yes, that's how I'm here. That's why I'm here. So we decided we're going to get shirts made that say, yes, I came all this way. I'm a front-end developer, and I work a lot with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, I do want to start off as a bit of a disclaimer because when I've previously given this talk, people have somehow interpreted it as me hating on JavaScript and saying JavaScript is stupid, it doesn't have a place. So the irony of this is my slides are written in JavaScript. I use Reveal.js for my slides. So if anyone thinks that I think JavaScript is a horrible thing that shouldn't exist on the internet, I mean, I kind of do, but I will still continue to use it on a regular basis. So while I do build things with JavaScript, that doesn't mean that JavaScript is always the answer. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. Because the thing is, JavaScript is useful. JavaScript does have a use, but the problem is it is often overused. And there are a lot of cases where using HTML and CSS would actually be lighter than using JavaScript. So today we're going to go through and we're going to build a little website. We're going to look through a website that has been built because they'd been having issues with Surface devices yesterday. So last night I got to go through and rewrite my talk to not live demo in case it was still broken today. So we're going to go through a website that is built with no JavaScript. That means no JavaScript build tools, no NPM packages, just HTML and CSS. To do that, we're going to start off with a couple of tricks, some HTML tricks. These will include things like content targeting, accordions, and form validations, a lot of things that we use JavaScript for. So I'm going to start off with content targeting. Now, who here knows what a link element, like an anchor tag, a link element in HTML is? Yeah. A link element is how we link to another page, another website, or another resource. So it could be another page on our site. It could be another website altogether. We can use it to link to a file or a resource to download or view elsewhere. Or we can use it to link to a certain section of a page by referencing an ID as a hash value. So this is often used in skip to main content, or if we want to send somebody to a certain point on a page. Now, not only does this exist with HTML, but we can then use CSS and check whether or not a particular element on a page is currently being targeted. And so we can go through and style something that is targeted based on the hash value in the URL. So here we have a little web page, and this has a whole bunch of content on a page. And I want to build a single page app experience because we love single page apps. I really like when things don't have to reload. So I'm going to build a single page app experience. Now, the structure of my HTML document, I've got a header which has navigation and links to various sections referencing the IDs. And then I have a bunch of sections on a page that have IDs. And I'm going to go through and write some CSS, which says to hide all of the sections on the page. But then if a section is being targeted, so if a section has a hash value in the URL, then display block. I want it to display. And what that does is I can then go through and click on my navigation links, and it will, I'm going to replay the video again. It will go through and navigate between different sections of my page. So there, I have managed to create a single page app experience with no JavaScript whatsoever. That's pretty cool, right? We're talking front end today, so browser support is something we will be thinking about. The target CSS pseudo selector has pretty amazing browser support. It's been around for so long that even IE knows what to do with it. So this is one that we can actually use in production in our websites, and we don't have to worry about whether or not it's being supported. Full disclosure though, this involves working with URL hash values and isn't a great alternative most of the time and is not great for accessibility. So full disclosure, we're having a little bit of fun here today. We're going to do a lot of things that you can do, but there may be particular use cases or reasons why that doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it. So full disclosure, there can be a couple of issues if we're using this. However, still a very useful tool. Next is accordions. Who here has ever built an accordion? Who here has installed a JavaScript package to build an accordion? Kind of feel like a lot of you are lying. Who here has used an existing installed JavaScript package to build an accordion? Yeah, technicalities. There is a HTML element for this. Well, two HTML elements. The details and summary elements allow us to create a collapsible content section, like an accordion, without any JavaScript. The summary is the preview that is available all the time, and then everything else inside the details is shown when we expand it out. So here, if I have a whole bunch of FAQs on a page, which is where we often use these kinds of sections, I can go through and have all my content, which is still accessible, it is still searchable, and I have some nice little collapsible sections with no JavaScript whatsoever, which is pretty cool. Browser support, these elements have been around for a while as well, so we've got pretty good browser support. This is actually a really amazing element and definitely one that I recommend using on websites today. This one doesn't really have much of a disclosure. These are really good elements. Even when browsers don't support it, say if you did have somebody using IE and they don't support the elements, they just display it open. So it's a really great user experience for anybody who's on an older browser. Full disclosure though, with JavaScript, you can make it work just slightly nicer so that when you open one, all the others close, which is one of the main limitations that we have. Next, form validations. I love form validations. I especially love when people have really specific form validations, which don't remotely stop me from entering a form for stupid reasons. Like an inability to book a hire car because I haven't filled in my discount code coupon because I don't have a discount code coupon, and because the discount code coupon field is not visible on the form for me, yet somehow is a required field. Required fields. Required fields are fun. This is a really great HTML function, native HTML functionality. We can add the required attribute and people can't submit the form unless they fill in the field. No JavaScript used whatsoever. We can also then validate the particular data format that we're using. For example, there are various different types of input fields like date and time, which will ensure that we get data in the right format. We can also provide patterns to input fields for various different types of data patterns, for example, phone numbers, to let people know the format or the pattern that we would expect to get data in. For example, there are a lot of different ways that we can write out phone numbers. There are a lot of different ways that we can format, where you put the spaces, are there brackets, are there hyphens between things. We can add the pattern attribute, let them know what pattern it is that we're expecting, and it will not allow the user to submit the form unless the pattern matches. Now, this is really useful because we can go through and we can ensure that fields are valid, fields are filled in, and the form cannot be submitted unless we get the data we require in the format that we expect. So this is fully client-side, straight away being validated, and I know exactly what is going on. Except for the fact that the data pattern that I defined on this is a little bit stupid, and I don't like this. It won't let me submit the form unless the pattern matches and I fill in any required fields. Browser support for these are pretty good. For example, input of type tel for phone numbers. This has been around for a while, and the pattern attribute has also been around for a while as well. So this is something that we can go through and use easily. Full disclosure, there are limited validation capabilities directly in HTML, and JavaScript can add more powerful abilities. For example, using JavaScript, we can add additional error messaging, adjust it, working with the native browser errors, but adding our own context and further information about why a field is invalid and how users can go through and fix it. Next, we're going to have a look at some CSS tricks, which means we're going to write some CSS. I love writing CSS. It's my favorite thing. Some tricks with CSS involve things like nesting, range sliders, testimonial sliders, toggle switches, and every developer's favorite thing to build, image carousels. Love building image carousels so much. Sarcasm, in case anybody can't get it through my Australian accent as well. I refuse to build image carousels. You cannot pay me enough for that. First off, nesting. One of the big use cases for JavaScript is in build tools, and I do use this on a regular basis. Things like CSS pre-processors or post-processors or formatters to make it easier when I'm writing CSS. One of the main reasons why I use one of these is nesting. Because anybody who has ever had to write a large amount of unnested CSS understands the pain and why we love preprocessors, which allow us to nest things a little bit easier. Nesting is now part of native CSS functionality, and I'm really excited about this because this is one of the last uses that I have for a preprocessor. So this means that I can already go through, nest my CSS, it's easier to write, and I don't have to worry about a JavaScript build tool anymore. Nesting is relatively new, came out last year, but is supported in the major browsers. So we can start to have a play around with some of this. Next, we want to look at range sliders. Now, range sliders are another type of input, and this is where we can go through and get, rather than just getting a number, it's from a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 or whatever range that we're going through and doing. Now, for this, I want to talk about one particular CSS trick that I like, which is using the new CSS pseudo selector, the has selector. Now, the has selector allows us to look inside of an element without going inside of it. So In this particular case, we are checking, on the first line, we are checking if the div has a paragraph that is the first child. What this means is we're able to count the number of elements that exist inside of a parent. So in this case, if a div has a paragraph that is the first child, we know that there is one paragraph. And so I can set a CSS variable on that div to say that there's one child. Then if there's a div that has a paragraph that is the fourth child, I know there's 4. We can go on and on and on and on with this. So using this has selector and checking for nth child, we're able to go through and count how many elements we have inside of a parent. In this use case, we're looking at a range selector and we're looking at how many labels, how many options we have inside our list associated with our range selector. So this is where our range selector is on our web page. Currently doesn't have any visible labels, so we want to go through and fix that and make it look a little bit nicer. Now, on that, we have currently 6 labels. We have 6 labels associated with it. So we're going to go through and we're going to go through and count them out inside. So if my form has an input of type range that then has a data list directly next to it, which has an option, which is a first child, then I'm going to set the options to be 1. If my input of type range has a data list that has a direct sibling that's a data list that has an option, nth child 2 has 2, and so on and so forth, all the way up to 10, because I know that I'm probably not going to have more than 10 and I don't want to keep writing all of this CSS. That's a little bit much. So I'm going to go through and count how many labels I have using this. Next, I'm going to get my input of type range, and I want this to be pretty much full width, but add slight gap on the side so that my labels have a little bit of room. Then I want to get the data list that is directly next to the range, and I want to set display grid, and I want to set the number of columns again the same as the number of items that I have. I want a resizable column and then a gap, and then I want to have a 50 pixel column at the beginning to adjust things along so it lines up a bit nicely. I want each of my labels, which are my options element, to span across 3 of those columns, and I want every second one to start on the second row, so that's going to bring them down. What this does is this will line my labels up like this all the way along my range selector with a little bit of a gap on either side, and every second one will go down so that they're not overlapping too much. Which this is pretty cool. Like, that's pretty well aligned labels on a range selector. The range selector is also native HTML element, so we don't really have to do anything else. We can use CSS to line up my labels nicely to provide context for what it is that we're getting on this range slider, and this is already a functional form element ready for us to use. Input of type range has been around for quite a while, ever since Internet Explorer was a browser, so that one is still available to be used. Data list, which are our labels associated with our range selector, with our range slider, has been around for quite a while, except for in Firefox. That still has fairly decent browser support. The has selector, which we use to count the number of children inside of a parent, unfortunately is relatively new, so whether or not you're able to use that, it is thankfully supported in Firefox now. That came out late last year. Next, we want to have a look at testimonials. I have built a lot of testimonial sliders. So this is where we can go through and people can add their testimonials and their quotes about what it is, and we can switch between them. Now, to do this, I can use a little bit of a hack using HTML radio inputs. So inside of my testimonial slider, each testimonial has 3 elements. I have a radio input, I have a label for my radio input, because form input should always have labels, and then I have the quote directly afterwards. Now my testimonials element, I want to go through and use grid. I want a nice big resizable section at the top and then a smaller section at the bottom which will resize as big as it needs to be. And I want to go through and use the has selected to count how many quotes I have inside. Using the number of quotes I have, I want to go through and create enough columns for each of them with a gap on either side again. I then want to go through and set my quotes to stay in the top part of my grid all the way across from end to end. And I want my labels, which I'm going to use to be able to navigate between them, I want them to go all the way to the end and sit on the second row. And what that does is gives me something like this, which doesn't look fantastic for now because all of the quotes are visible, but they're all sitting where it is that they need to be. I then want to go through and hide all of my quotes so that they all have an opacity of 0. So they're still there. They just can't be seen and they can't be clicked on. I then want to go through and look to find my input of type radio that is checked. So if the radio input is checked, I want to get the label directly after it, which is the label associated with that radio input, and then get the quote directly after that, which is the quote that's associated with the radio input. And I want to set that opacity to be 1 and turn pointer events back on. And what this will do is I can navigate through clicking on the labels for each quote, and it will display the relevant quote. Now, because of how my grid has been set up as well, it will also not change size. So it will stay sized for the biggest quote. Now, to make my labels like nice little inputs at the bottom so that you can switch it rather than the text that says testimonial 1, 2, etc. I want to use the before and after pseudo elements to create a little circle about 20 pixels high and wide and have a border on that. The after pseudo selector is what I'm going to use to show if it has been selected. I'm styling this a little bit like a radio input, and so I want to use a radial gradient to have a green dot in the middle and then a bit of a gap on the outside. And what that does is that will give me something that looks like a nicely styled radio button and a radio input, and I can tell whether or not it has been selected. Last couple of things to line everything up nicely together. I want to go through and get the first label that exists and shift that one over to start at the second column to center things nicely. I then want to go through, and none of these are selected by default. So I want to check if the testimonials doesn't have a radio input that has been checked. I want to get the first quote and make that visible. So if it doesn't have anything that's going to be checked, we're going to simulate that the first one has been checked. Whoops. And this means that we can navigate through all of our testimonials very easily. Now, The has selector, we've already looked at. This has been around for a couple of years, last year in Firefox, so the browser support's getting better. The not selector, so checking if a CSS selector doesn't match, that has been around for a little bit longer. That one's got pretty good browser support. And CSS Grid, which we use to lay it all out, has been around since 2017. So that one has, I checked the other day, I think that's got about 98% support in Europe. So that one's pretty good. Full disclosure, in this particular use case, we are messing around with form inputs and using them for different purposes than originally intended, which isn't fantastic. For accessibility purposes, I would recommend adding some ARIA labels to give more context behind what the elements are being used for anybody using assistive technologies such as screen readers. And it may be confusing for them as to why people are clicking on radio inputs to change testimonials. Next, switches. Switches we often like to have to toggle between something being on or off, whether it's view or edit, light or dark, various different types of switches. My HTML will look a little bit like this. Everything's wrapped inside of a div with a class of toggle. Inside of it, I have two radio inputs, on and off. And these have associated labels, and then I have a span with a class of switch, which I'm going to use to style my switch. It looks a little bit like this for now. I want to go through and use Flexbox to align the switch nicely, so that will keep it nice and centered. And then I want to go through and get my input of type radio with a value of on and get the label associated with that input and send it to the end of it. So I want to put that one last. So we'll have off, switch, on. Which does this. Next, I want to go through and add a pseudo element to my switch. And I'm going to make this a little circle to appear on my switch. And I'm going to set position absolute and then move it up a little bit so that it aligns nicely with where it's sitting with my switch. Set a width and height so that is circular. And then set a border so that that will also match with my switch. I then want to go through and check if my input of type radio has a value of on is checked. I want to get the switch that's next to it and set the background color. So if the switch is turned on, set the background color to a different color and move the little toggle on the switch over. What that does is create a functioning switch. If it's off, if it's on, I'm able to see what it is that's going on. Lastly, to make things a little bit nicer, because at the moment I can click on the labels to change it, but I can't click on the switch to change it. So I want to go through and for both of my radio inputs, I want to get the label directly next to it and add a pseudo element which will sit directly over the label. The radio input with a value of on, which I know is after the switch, I want that one to overlay a bit further across, so that will overlay on top of the switch. And the radio with a value of off, which I know is before my switch, I want that one to go a little bit over the switch as well. What that does is my pseudo elements will overlay on top of the switch, which means whichever one is being clicked on, which means I'm able to click on the label associated with it when I'm clicking on the switch. So if my input of type radio is checked, want to get the direct next label, get the before pseudo element and set the content. So that means when I go through and click on the switch, I'm able to turn it off and on again. Now, on my web page, I already have a switch that's here ready to go in the bottom, in the footer. And this is my theme toggle, because all good websites in 2024 should have dark mode and light mode. So I have a little switch so that people can turn dark mode or light mode on. I'm able to go through and using my has selector, I can check if the body has a theme toggle which has an input of type radio that has a value of light that is checked. I can set CSS variables for my various different colors being used to their lighter colors. So they're darker colors for a light background. If my body has a theme toggle which has an input of type radio that has a value of light that is checked, that has a value of dark that is checked, I can set my background to a dark color, my text to a light color, and associated colors with it as well. What that gives me is a functioning theme toggle. I can turn on light mode, I can turn on dark mode, I can switch between them, and that is reflected throughout my web page in a single toggle. The has selector we've already looked at. This one has been around for a few years, so that one's a bit new, but it's okay. Full disclosure, similar to testimonials, we're using form inputs in for a purpose different than originally intended, so this isn't great for accessibility. Once again, would recommend adding ARIA labels or roles to provide additional context. And using JavaScript in this case would make it a little bit nicer, because we could save the state in local storage and allow it to persist on page reload. Lastly, image carousels. Love building image carousels. This is a little bit faster when I'm not live coding and I just get to go through the different content. Image carousels. Our image carousel is a little bit similar to our testimonial slider. Each image in the carousel has an associated radio input label and a div with a class of image that has its image inside of it. I'm going to go through and use CSS Grid to lay out my image carousel. I want 3 columns, gap either side, which is where my controls are going to go, and then a big spot in the middle. I only want 1 row, which I want 300 pixels high, because that's about as good size for an image. And I want to set names to them. So they are previous, image, and next. So this is where the previous button's going to go, this is where the image is going to go, and this is where the next button is going to go. I then want to set a maximum width so it doesn't overflow the page, and I want anything that does overflow to be hidden. So I don't want to see anything that's not in the visible area. I then want my image to sit in the grid area of image, and I'm going to set opacity to be 0. So it's there, but I just can't see it for now. Lastly, I want to set the labels to be display none, because for now I don't want to see any of the labels. What this will do is this will lay out my carousel a little bit like this. Does this look like a carousel? Apart from the missing image, this looks a little bit like we'd expect a carousel to look. Next, the fun bits. I want to find an input of type radio that is checked. I want to get the label directly after that and get the image directly after that and set the opacity to be 1. So that image is visible. I then want to check, so the same as for the testimonials, we want to simulate if none of them have been checked. So I want to check if the carousel does not have an input of type radio that is checked. I want to get the input of type radio that is the first of its type, and get the label directly after that, get the image directly after that, and set the opacity to be 1 so we can see that one. Next, I want to go through and add some controls. So I want to find the input of type radio that is checked and get the label directly next to that and get the image directly next to that. That's the current image. I want to get the radio input that's directly next to that and get the label that's directly next to that. That's my next control. And so I want that one to go in grid area next. So that's where my next control is going to go. And I'm going to set that one to be a next arrow, well, a next arrow emoji. Then I want to get an input of type radio that isn't checked. So if it's not checked, I want to then have a look if it has a label directly next to that, that has an image directly next to that, that has an input directly next to that, that is checked. That means that one is the previous image. So get the label directly next to that and set that one to be the previous button. Have I completely confused you now? Couple of laughs, couple of head shakes, and a couple of people asleep. I would take that as a yes, I have confused you. What that does is that puts my image in the middle. If my image is visible, it means the next radio input is the next button, so that one appears there. If an image isn't visible, but the next one is, it means that one was the previous one. And I have a functioning, animated image carousel with controls between the different images with no JavaScript. CSS Grid, once again, been around for quite a while. This one's got pretty good browser support. Has selector, little bit less browser support, but that one's getting much better. Full disclosure, image carousels still suck. Still hate them. Just because there's no JavaScript doesn't mean I think that they should be built on websites. When clients ask me to build an image carousel, I will absolutely argue for reasons why they shouldn't. And so far, none of them have disagreed with me that much. Carousels aren't good for accessibility or for performance. In this particular use case, I would also recommend turning off animation based on a media query for prefers reduced motion in case people have opted to reduce the motion and animations on their computer for accessibility reasons. And don't do this. Don't do an image carousel. Just use a gallery. Just use a gallery or something else. Please don't build an image carousel. So I understand that we have been looking at code and you're kind of trusting that the thing that I've said is actually related to it, and it does actually work. So if you don't believe me, this website is live, nojs.amyscapers.dev. You can go and have a look at that website now. You can turn JavaScript off in your browser and it will all still functionally work. Unless you're in Internet Explorer for those couple of little things that it didn't support. But if anybody has Internet Explorer on their phone or even on their computer, I'm just going to be impressed more than anything. JavaScript is useful. Even though we've just talked about building a whole bunch of stuff without JavaScript, there are some use cases where JavaScript would make it better. JavaScript still has a use and it can still be useful, but it's not always the answer. I want you to have a think when you go back to work next week or tomorrow or later on after this, if unfortunately you don't get the day off and you get to still work when you're not in a session. Have a think about whether or not you need JavaScript. Have a think about whether or not can you do it with HTML. Are there any JavaScript packages for date pickers or autofill fields, or for accordions that you could replace with a HTML element. Can you do it with CSS? Are you using JavaScript to do animations when actually a CSS animation would do it? Could you use CSS to change things a little bit more and you take away some of the JavaScript? And if you are using JavaScript, I want you to have a think about whether or not can JavaScript make it better? Can it improve the user's experience? And are you using JavaScript to make it better? Can some of the JavaScript that you've written be removed? Is some of it not being used anymore? Can some of it go? Third-party JavaScript, do we really need to track this? Yes, we have the tracking script. Yes, marketing probably said we needed the tracking script. When was the last time that someone actually looked at this? Do we still really need to track this? I know we're a little bit better in the EU at tracking things, not tracking things that we don't need to. I know that based on the fact that every time I come to NDC Oslo, I forget until all of the cookie pop-ups appear. For websites I look at on a regular basis, but I come here and I need the cookie pop-ups. So have a think about, do we really need to track this? And I want you to have a think about whether or not the JavaScript we're writing, are we writing JavaScript for good or for evil? Can we replace it with something else? Any questions?
I'm gonna put you on the spot. Do you have any good hacks for internationalization?
Do I have any good hacks for internationalization? Internationalization isn't something I've done a lot of. So one thing I would probably talk about would be using the lang attribute. So the lang attribute allows us to define a language on the element. Potentially whether or not you could, I could do a hack that had like a select a language from a number of languages, and based on the selection, hide elements based on whether or not the content was from the selected language. Yeah, but other than that, I've not done too much on internationalization. If there are any more questions afterwards, if you think of them, or if you just don't want to ask a question in front of a whole bunch of people, I will be around for the rest of the conference. The slides for this talk and the demo are available online. And thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for coming and learning about building websites, hopefully with less JavaScript.